Today's verse is John chapter 16, verse 33. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Have you ever experienced a pain so profound that words simply fail to capture its depth? I was enjoying a relaxed Sunday afternoon in July a few years ago, catching up on my Bible reading plan, enjoying my quiet time at home. And around afternoon, I briefly considered calling up my younger brother, Ivan, so that he would help me carry this large table into the shop. But on a second thought, I figured, I'd probably try to do it myself so that I can surprise him once I have it set up, and then I can give him a tour of the shop. Because there were other things I was bringing in as well. I haven't seen him in a few weeks. I spoke on the phone with him a few days before. He was wondering if he could park one of his cars on our property. And so on that Sunday, as I was sitting and thinking through all these things, I decided to invite the siblings to spend the evening together. We do that throughout the summer. So I offered to go play tennis on a family chat. This was 2023, before the whole pickleball took over. And Ivan was going to show up. He said he was going to be there. But little did I know that around the time as we were getting ready to go to the park, a train was departing from Bellingham, a train that within an hour would tragically claim the life of my younger brother. He was 24 years old. He was one of those siblings in the family that changes the whole dynamic of a room. He struggled ever since middle school, bouncing between the pull of all that life has to offer and a desire to live an ordered life. He was full of passion and goals and ideas, and right before his death, he seemed to have so many things going so well for him. And yet on that day, at 5 p.m., he took his last breath. He was gone, and we had to process that as a family. Amid thousands of questions, it was so abrupt and final that it takes you a while to catch up with the reality. For days following, my mind would just keep searching for a way out, as if there was something that we've missed, and if I only could figure it out, everything would be normal again. Everything would be okay. And so the pain and the loss and the questions and the helplessness and the regret and fears and denial and anger and frustration, it all comes in a package. It all keeps pummeling down on you day after day with no end in sight. And this launched me into probably the darkest and longest lasting experience of suffering that I've ever felt. Now, in my short life, both in pastoral ministry and otherwise, I've got to share in a lot of different experiences with people, some of the coolest moments in life, both with my family and friends, the joys of doing ministry with a bunch of passionate people, giving away their best years to serve, sacrificially, do good for the sake of others. We've had the joys of friends growing in their relationship with God through a dark season, the joys of couples finding out that they are pregnant after waiting for a long time for a child, people praying for a loved one and receiving healing, people wrestling with a difficult choice in life and finding an answer from God as they take a step of faith, people celebrating new chapters in life, and so on, right? I've also experienced a surprising number of suffering, or a surprising number of cases, suffering and pain, both in my own life and in the life of others, where we were sitting together and grieving a relationship that's lost or broken, grieving a miscarriage, grieving a betrayal, or lamenting over somebody's destructive choices in life, sitting in the pain that doesn't go away, comforting a parent whose child passes away at a young age, right? But this was on a whole nother level. It was something that you feel in your bones, and it doesn't leave you. It paints your whole life a certain shade. If you experience grief, right, like you know that it takes over, and you live in the shadow of this grief. You try to enjoy life as it was, and it's never the same. It's weird because it's both numb and raw at the same time. You're kind of feeling both. So this loss of a loved one was hard to process. With others, with myself, with the family. As you look at your own life, I'm sure that you could resonate with the pain and suffering It's part of our existence in this world, and I think that the title of the series alone probably brought up a moment or two or a dozen of your own life where you've felt the pain and suffering. And one thing to realize is that pain is not something we can avoid. We shouldn't seek it out. That's definitely weird. It's a sign of psychological deviation. But neither should we live in denial of existence of pain, or in complete disregard of its potential to be redeemed, no matter how horrible it is. Now, we'll talk in a bit as to why we even have pain and suffering, but for now, what I think is important for us to realize is that we won't escape it. And so the invitation is both from our Creator, the Christian theology and doctrine, but also from the best of psychology. The invitation is to find hope in pain, is to embrace it, to meet it head on, because we have something that can carry us through. We have to search for that, something that can carry us through the other side of the pain, that we are going to face it, we're going to talk about it, we're going to live through it. But that first step is to acknowledge that pain and suffering befalls all of us in this world. Here's how the late pastor and theologian Tim Keller put it in his book on walking with God through pain and suffering. He says, therefore, no matter what precautions we take, no matter how well we have put together a good life, no matter how hard we have worked to be healthy, wealthy, comfortable, with friends and family, and successful with our career, something will inevitably ruin it. No amount of money, power, and planning can prevent bereavement, dire illness, relationship betrayal, financial disaster, or a host of other troubles from entering your life. Human life is fatally fragile and subject to forces beyond our power to manage it. Life is tragic. So there has to be a level of acceptance. I mean, we all intuitively, after thinking about it for a while, we realize, yeah, that's the reality. So there has to be a level of acceptance of pain, but the way that we go about accepting pain also matters. The narratives or the stories that we create around our own experiences, meaning how we interpret the pain and perceive the suffering, it will determine the kind of people we will become. Our response to pain matters. It determines whether we will embrace, from a Christian perspective, God in His wisdom, that He can transform the pain and us in the process, or whether we will remain in that shadow of suffering, isolated, resentful, and bitter. But pain is an inevitable part of life. It already has visited all of us in some form or another. I mean, to be honest, if you think about it, we lived with pain our whole life, right? Whether we bump our toe or scrape our knee or burn ourselves or lose something precious or things don't go our way or someone really hurts us with words or actions, a lot of these we go through without even thinking twice about it. So we are used to pain in some way, and pain is actually a good signal. I mean, in itself, pain is neutral, if you think about it. It's neither good or bad. You might enjoy the warmth of a fire, right? But you get a little bit too close to it, and what do? You get the signal of like, I'm too close, I'm burning myself right now. Pain will alert you to withdraw or do something about it, or change the circumstances, or reevaluate where you're at. But when pain is prolonged or doesn't go away, or cannot be remediated by us, it turns into suffering. And over time, we happen to experience greater pains or greater emotional losses, and all of that, we carry it within us. We carry the history of our life in our bodies and in our minds, and it accumulates over time. And then comes a moment when something beyond our usual capacity shakes our world, right? And that's when we lose footing. That's when suffering really starts to yell at us. And what usually happens in that moment is that whatever your interpretive grid for the world, like whatever the narrative that you see your life through, or whatever the story that of the reality that we live, it gets tested. You're trying to see. I mean, we start to question the reality itself. We become painfully aware of our dependence, of our fragility, of our limits. Same Tim Keller says this: when pain and suffering comes upon us, we finally see not only that we are not in control of our lives, but that we never were in control. We realize that we need support to go through pain, right? Those moments, they really hit us, and we look for others, that we need help. But I think it's more than just psychological or social support that we are seeking in those moments. We need something deeper. I'd say something spiritual, something transcendent and yet at the same time more real than the pain or the experience that we're having right now. We need meaning to see through the other side of pain. If there is that other side, we need a reason to make sense of why. Why does my daughter have to suffer? Why is my husband taken away so soon? Why do we have to weep over caskets? Where do I find hope in all of this? Why this disease? Why me? Why do I have to face this betrayal, depression, anguish, loss, anxiety? Why now? We need to know the rest of the story. We need to make sense somehow out of it. Christian psychologist and author David Benner says this: ultimately, we need a meaning strong enough to make our suffering sufferable. This is the crucial test of any life meaning. It has to help us live life. And for it to do that, it has to help us cope with suffering. See, suffering has a way of hyper-focusing our attention. It puts a spotlight on the gap between what we believe and how we live, and whatever our experience is. It really spotlights that difference, especially if we've been growing that gap between what we perceive the world to be. Pain has a way of spotlighting it. Nothing shatters our stories more than an intrusion of pain and suffering. I mean, the stories that we tell ourselves about life, about the world, about everything in our life. And in turn, our response can determine whether we will persevere or suffer through the pain and suffering. We can no longer ignore that gap when pain comes into our life, and we have to confront the questions head on. Suffering or pain can become a way through which we come closer to God. It happens quite often. Many have faced a devastating loss only to realize their dependence either on God or on others, right? And so they are drawn more close to God through those. Or people who have hit rock bottom, reached the end of their self-sufficiency, and recognized that they discovered in the whole process the loving, healing, and restoring presence of God again in His people. Pain can lead us towards healing. C.S. Lewis, in his book on the problem of pain, puts it this way: but pain insists upon being attended to. See, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It's His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Now, notice that He doesn't say that God is the author of that pain. Pain and suffering are not the creation of God. Pain and suffering is a byproduct of humanity choosing to attempt to live life without God. But what He's saying is that God takes even the evil that has come about through our rebellion as humanity, and He uses it out of love to arouse or to rouse a deaf world, to wake up a deaf world to its miserable state of being disconnected with God. It's a signal that says something went really wrong, to wake us up to the reality and to invite us into the healing and love of the Father, as all of us expect the final renewal and redemption of all who long for a world being set right. So one response to pain is to seek God. And people oftentimes will face pain and they will seek Him closely, honestly, openly. But the other response is that people have to pain and suffering is that they sometimes find themselves driven away farther from God, pushing away God. And it's happened so often, someone might have been living without a thought or even a reference to God, but once tragedy strikes or suffering enters their world, a person all of a sudden says, how could a loving God let this happen? Where in a moment, a person went from indifference to anger toward God, and then probably ignored Him altogether going forward, right? And so, whichever our response, one is always looking for ways of coping with pain and suffering, whether we're going to look by looking to the Creator or we're going to go and look for it elsewhere. Now, our culture here in the West especially, we see pain as detached from all sort of meaning. Like, if in the past, and even today, elsewhere in the world, in different cultures, and even in different religions, there always existed at least some narrative that would give meaning to the pain, how pain and suffering could become a way towards healing, or how it a signal for you to get better, or I don't know, appease the gods or whatever. There was always some kind of meaning that was attached, becoming a better person, changing the social structure of the place where suffering and pain is being experienced. Then what we have today in a late modern secular thought, especially, like I said, here in the West and around the world, is that we sterilized suffering from its human experience. As if it's a and an intrusion, a mere interruption to our individual pursuit of happiness, notice, in a random and meaningless world. It's random and meaningless, but somehow it's an interruption to our pursuit of happiness. And so, as a result, I think we miss out on the good that could have been done in us if we see beyond the pain and suffering and see the condition that the world is in. Right? If we listen to this, to what is the pain pointing us to, and most of the time is pointing to the fact that the world is messed up, that it's a place that was not meant to be like that, and that we are ultimately responsible for it. And to see that there's an urgent need of a Savior, that we need to have Him come and repair all that has been broken and do that once and for all. And so our response to suffering matters. It determines how our journey is going to be through it. It will shape us in the process. If we choose to deal with pain, it can be redeemed. It can be worked through. But if we conceal it and bury within it ourselves, carrying that burden and grief and resentment alone, then it will continue to live inside of us. If we don't let that pain to be dealt with either in the community, right, with others, then it will continue to live in us, infecting us more than just our bodies, more than just our minds, and if not attended to, ultimately probably even our destinies. Even the psychologists remind us that suffering is a result of how we process pain. That suffering is a response to pain. That it can either become a defining narrative of our life, or it can lead to a place of healing and acceptance. The way we respond to pain, prolonged pain or otherwise. And so, over the next 2 months, we hope to explore. It's not an easy subject, but we hope to explore it together with Paul and Stan. This idea of how the story of God is working through humanity towards restoration and renewal, and how pain and suffering fits into all of that. The story of God who comes and enters our messed up history and our messed up states and situations and where we're at today as humanity. He comes to suffer for and alongside with us, to take that suffering upon Himself and to offer us the most solid hope one can ever hold on to, both in this age and in the age to come, but also here now, right, through His presence, through His peace, through His community. And so what I hope that you will see through this whole exploration is that the Christian worldview is the only one that consistently makes sense of the problem of evil and suffering in a just and a redemptive way. That Jesus is the only way for our pain to be not meaningless, but meaningful, or could be made meaningful, that He redeems us, and that our suffering could be remade into joy, ultimately. Now, I want to attend now to the few lines that were given to the disciples by Jesus that Matt read to us today. He gives them these lines in the midst of His own mental anguish and suffering. So He's about to go into the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where it's going to be His final prayer before He's arrested and betrayed. And it's also going to be like on a cusp, at that time when the disciples are about to go out and be on their own, if you will, for a season. And so He's giving them as a warning in this whole really emotionally charged situation of impending pain and suffering. So John 16:33, there's 4 statements here that I want to take a look at today with you. The first one is, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace, says Jesus. That's one. Then He says, in the world you will have tribulation. Then He says, but take heart. And finally, I have overcome the world. So the first line where He says, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. He's referring to this idea of shalom. Like the idea of peace in the Bible was inferred from or informed by this Hebrew word shalom, which means wholeness. Not just peace in terms of tranquility that you experience when everything is well, but like this wholeness of life, health, safety, prosperity. That's all that's meant by that word shalom. The thriving of a world well ordered, where everything just fits together just properly in its own place. Notice how that's the opposite of suffering, right? You got the health and safety and prosperity and thriving. And so what Jesus is saying here to the disciples and ultimately to all of us is that, hey, notice, He's speaking to them, He's saying, hey, notice, I've been teaching you about the kingdom, right? about the coming kingdom, how it's not of this world. But your life will remain in this world. But what I want you to keep in mind is that your shalom, your wholeness, your health and safety and prosperity of your life, it is not of this world. That your shalom and all of it is in me, says Jesus. It is in Him that you've been redeemed, and you already, if you will, are living from the future part of the new creation. Right? It's almost like we're living from the future into the now. Because the promise is ultimately resurrection, and it's given to us the moment we accept Him. So He's basically saying, don't forget that your shalom, or your wholeness, or your peace is in me, not in this world. And He's also saying that you'll need this, because your circumstances will still reflect the consequences of the world that you live in. But you're no longer bound to the death curse forever. You've been freed. And yes, death will, even though it will take away your body one day, or sickness might linger and last, it will not have the final word over you, says Jesus. I do now. Your shalom, your safety, your security is now fully in me. Your peace, your shalom is in me. And then He goes on to say, you will have many trials and sorrows. You will have many trials and sorrows in the world. The Bible has always been open to the problem of suffering. It never attempts to avoid it, deny, or despair over it. The problem of suffering is real, and it's prevalent. And we'll speak about the problem of evil next Sunday. Like, what do we do with evil in the world and with evil in the Bible and in our neighborhoods? Like, how do we deal with the problem of evil? But for now, what we see here is Jesus reasserts or even promises to you and me that, yes, you, a follower of Jesus, one who decided to finally give up control over your own life and to give your life over lordship to Jesus so that He would rule over your life, that yes, you, who was made into a new creation, and you're awaiting the time when you're going to be resurrected in the new heaven and new earth, but in the meantime, you can expect the suffering and trials and sorrows. That even though we are His, we are still in this world. And you might say, but why? Won't my life all of a sudden change or get better if I decide to follow Jesus? I think yes, of course. I think that it's even a ginormous understatement that it will get better. Because when you come to Him, you finally will begin to live as you were meant to be. Your life in Him finally will begin to make sense. So you will be freed from the shackles of sins. You get to become the part of the community that gets to practice heaven in the midst of the sinful earth. Meaning that in the midst of humanity that still ignores and detests and rejects the rule of God. But that is the part, is that we're still living in the midst, and some people are on the way, and some people haven't responded yet. So it's not as easy of an operation to just clean up the whole mess in the world, because a lot of people are still in the process. There are members in my family that I still am praying for, right, for them to come and know Jesus. And so, for that reason, we still remain in a world where the free will of the one that we are praying for is still being respected. And it's still the time for humans to do its thing on earth. And yet, through you and through me, Jesus is doing something new. It is through us, through the community, who remains here with a secure future, but remains here and goes through it all for the sake of others. See, it all began in the very beginning when God created the world. The Bible tells us it was good. In fact, it was very good. The creation was very good, that the man and the woman were creatures who lived under the Creator in proper relationship. It was a world without pain. It was a world without suffering, death, or decay. And it would have remained that way because everything was running according to the standard operating procedures. Everything was following its proper course. And Adam and Eve, willingly, without compulsion, were given a life of taking care of the earth. They weren't robots. They weren't a computer program. They were also given a choice and an explanation of the consequences. And what we find is through the enemy of all that is good, beautiful, and kind comes a lie that turns everything upside down, questions the authority of God, paints a picture of, imagine you will be like gods yourself. Why do you need the guy up there to look over you, right? And there, in that moment of time, a fruit half-eaten in the hand of two of our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, right, taken a step into the world that became a reality for all of us, where they felt probably for the first time a set of new emotions and experiences, pain and suffering. Those were undoubtedly among the first feelings that they felt as they felt the fear and regret of disconnected from Creator. And from that moment on, we live in a fallen world, a deformed world, a world that is bent out of shape. It's a world that has a curse on it as a result of declining and quite aggressively saying, no, thank you very much, we'll run the world without you. And we continue to say that as civilizations, as countries, as individuals. And then we wonder why we get the consequences of what we get. Because most of us, we push God out of our life. We want to have a little piece of our own kingdom. And so suffering, as a result of the fall, came into our world. It's a world in which not only humans rebelled, but also, as Paul would say, the powers and dominions are at work as well, right? That are working against the will of God. Because even the Satan himself who deceived in the garden, right, he works against the will of God. And so suffering continues its course, rampaging through humanity. And I think that if you were to just watch it unfold, if God was to leave the earth alone and kind of let us have our own thing, it would have been completely swallowed up. And we would have probably met our demise in a full-blown annihilation of ourselves through hatred and violence. But God, who sustains even the breath in our lungs, right, in the first place, He did not give up. His love compels Him to see the good come out of the mess that we are making, even while we are making it. He comes into that mess. And also, somehow, in His infinite wisdom, He is able to make good come out of suffering. It's not because suffering is great or the suffering is good in itself, but that's the mess that we're in, and He's able to make good out of it. In fact, this whole discussion today, I want you to notice that God, He didn't look upon suffering and pain and provided a way or an escape through some theological or philosophical means. He Himself comes down and becomes like us. That's what's so compelling about the story that we see in the Bible. He enters and suffers for us instead of us, right? So that He can become the way for us. Like He gets personally, deeply involved in our story. He can relate. Think about it. God who suffers. God who is not a stranger to our pain. God who is not remote from our suffering. God that became a man to initiate the universe's biggest reversal of evil that the universe brought about upon itself. Isaiah says of Jesus in chapter 53 that He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. He's not a God that's detached. He's not a distant deity in the skies. He's not a cold and impersonal force that abandoned its creative project to self-destruction. But He's personally involved in the story. He gets down to our level. He begins the breakthrough of the reversal of the curse that we brought about through humanity in very ordinary ways, while still respecting the free will that He gave to us all. And that's why He, I think, employs us to do that work, because right now, it is the time still of human rebellion all around. And it is through us, through you and through me, by compelling others, that He gets to bring others into the restoration and into the renewal. And so Jesus says, and again, Jesus talked a lot about this to them, right? And so He says, take heart. That's why He's saying, that's why Jesus says to them, take heart, because you are welcomed into this macro story of the creation, of the new creation. You are welcome into this big story, so be joyful about it. You are not an insignificant or forgotten part of it, but you are precious, and so is your life, because for in you, because of our willingness and obedience to the return of the Creator, God can work out for good the evil or even the worst out in your life, whatever in your life. You might not see how it all makes sense while you are on this earth, but the invitation is to trust the one that created you, that in His wisdom He will make everything good again. And I mean, it follows, right? If He is the wisest of all, then it is, what can we offer with our small minds trying to grasp all of the complexities of Him working out all things, including the ones that are weird and really hard for us to understand and painful, how He's working them out for the good ultimately in the end. And so Jesus is saying, take heart, or actually He's saying, be joyful. He's saying rejoice. The word there is used to have joy, to have courage. Because now, even in our pain and suffering, or now even our pain and suffering can be redeemed, even here and now. Meaning that our breakdowns, which would have been just that, if that's what it was, just our breakdowns, our sufferings, our pains, can now become breakthroughs. That wasn't probably the intention of the original pain and suffering, but Jesus comes in and flips it on its head. In Romans 8:28 it says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose." Yes, even in the worst of our situations, when we entrust them to God and go through this whole process of grief and suffering, letting Him and His community heal and redeem whatever pain we're going and the evil that has been done to us or by us, yes, in all of these things, He will bend the history to make it so, meaning to redeem those moments. He goes so much as to say that every tear of yours and mine is accounted for, that your sorrows, they will not be wasted, that your lament is not for nothing, that your patience and trust will one day have a harvest of joy. In Psalm 126:5, we read this, "Those who sow with tears, one day your tears will bring a harvest of joy. They will reap with songs of joy." We can have joy and can have courage and can have resilience because of Him. He took that pain upon Himself. That is why at the heart of Christian theology and doctrine stands not a platitude, not a cliche phrase, not just a theological, some kind of explanation, but in the midst of your pain and suffering stands a person. That's the picture that the Word presents to us, and that's the experience that we have, is that Jesus, the Son of God, He offers you not a phrase to hold on to, but a relationship which is personal and deep and experiential that you could step into. He offers a narrative that resonates and resounds with all of our hearts, that this pain and suffering does not have the final word over me or over my family or over my children or over my friends. That justice is coming and mercy has been given. This world threw all it could at Jesus, and He overcame it all. And now, even in the midst of pain, we know that victory is now ours in Christ by His mercy. So what do I do with the death of my brother? Did I find all the answers? Did my grief find an end? Is it finally over? Where is God in all of that? There's more questions than answers, is where I'm at today. Not really. I haven't found a lot of answers, but in the midst of it all, if anything, I became more passionate for the work I'm doing, both in ministry and in my life. I have learned to be attuned to the bigger sufferings of others, to be more patient, to realize how fragile life is, how sometimes I see somebody, and to realize that that might be the last moment I get with them. And it puts a certain gravity, right, that I maybe wouldn't have otherwise. I was dreaming of a day when I would invite him to serve alongside. Now, at that time, we haven't planted the church yet, but we were like 6 months away from gathering together or 3 months away from gathering together as a team to kind of plan this. And I was dreaming of that day. You know, that song that we were singing today, Holy Forever, that was like, he was in a church quite often. And I remember like that song, he came over to the other church we were part of in Kirkland. That song was praying, and he was standing there worshiping. And I remember how that song, like, man, for a long period of time, it really sort of locked in with the passing of Ivan, the Holy Forever song. It took me a while to decouple that, right? Because I don't want to be crying every single time that I'm hearing that song. And by the way, the reason I'm a little better today because I was like, I need to process this at home, cry out my tears at home, so I don't have to bring the whole mess into here today. And it's important, you know, to go through that process, to let the tears flow, because I know that one day they will be redeemed. I was dreaming of a day when he would come here, maybe eventually get him to serve alongside with us, offer him an opportunity to experience church that is full of grace and support, that understands a person who's on the way, who's struggling, who's suffering. But instead, he was gone before I could do that. And my first funeral as a pastor was of my very own brother. So yeah, I don't have the answers. for a lot of things. I think of Job, this guy in the Old Testament, man who suffered greatly. But over the span of 42 chapters, he never gets to find out the reason for his suffering. And the point of the narrative is pretty simple. It's that you have to trust that God's thinking is so much higher than yours, that He is the creator, and He sees a much bigger picture than we can ever imagine, that you are just His creature. And that when you trust Him, even if it doesn't make sense, you know that He's working things out for the ultimate good. I remember when a student in my Sunday class got diagnosed with cancer. We prayed for healing. We prayed for God to bring about a miracle, and you bet her parents and relatives and everyone else around was praying for a healing. It was a long process of about a year or longer. And guess what? God was silent on that request, or maybe we weren't listening. Maybe He was answering. But I remember I was sharing at her funeral some of the homework notes that she wrote because she continued to attend Sunday school throughout the whole time. This was a 13-year-old kid. But her resilience and patience, this is a person who met suffering and allowed God to do something incredible through that suffering. Yeah, the suffering is horrible. The suffering was never to be intended there. But here's a 13-year-old, right? And her resilience and patience, her courage to love and love for God became even more evident as the sickness progressed. And you can't attribute that to just psychological conditioning of her parents or her family. Like, I have had conversations with her. I've read how she processed her faith. A 13-year-old taken away so soon, right? But she had this resilience and concern for the comfort of her family, for the future of, she was really concerned for the future of the young people in the church. That was her thoughts as her life was coming to an end. As a 13-year-old, taken away so soon. But even if I don't know the answers, I know that her story lives on. That's the most beautiful thing about it. We all in our souls, we have this thing of like, man, there's something more to life. There's no way that this is all of it, that you just, all the memories that you make, all of the connections, all of the dreams that you have, the fullness of human experiences that one day is just boom and gone. It's so vast and so huge that we expect it to live on forever. And that's what I know about her story, is that her story lives on. And that one day we get to meet her again, alongside with all of our loved ones that passed away in the Lord. I know that all of the tears that were shed for her, or for my brother, or for the pain that you are thinking of right now or experiencing, that all of the tears that you shed over that painful moment or prolonged suffering, that all of them will turn into joy one day. But in the meantime, we will get stronger through pain. Not because of it, not because it's good in itself, but in spite of it. We will become a community of healing that doesn't run away from pain and suffering, but brings love and healing and sits with the one in need of a prayer and support. I think that in the midst of it, as we will step in to deal with pain and suffering, we will learn to just sit together in each other's pain in the meantime. I hope that instead of pushing away the pain, we'll lean in closer to Christ through pain, and that we will be there for one another. Sometimes, as we've done here in the church, just sitting in silence together, lamenting together, praying together, not having the answers, not knowing even sometimes how to pray. Whether it's in the pews of the church or the semi-comfortable chairs in one of those coffee shops where you meet somebody, or on the couch of your and mine living room, we'll go through it together. That's the invitation, to go through the painful moments together, knowing that Jesus went ahead and that the glorious reversal has already begun. And we are part of it already. We are the glorious joys in the making, even in the midst of pain and sorrow. I'll close with these words by K.G. Ramsey from her book, This Too Shall Last. Kind of a twist on the phrase, this too shall pass, right? This too shall last. She suffers from autoimmune disease, and her book was her way of processing her ongoing suffering. Finding grace when suffering lingers. Early in the book, she invites the reader to sit on this figurative couch, which is also meant to become a real couch in your and my life as we sit with others in pain. It's one of the the most potent things we can do in somebody's pain and suffering is to be there with them, for them, through it all. A couch where you process the pain in the in-between now and forever. And here's what she says, and I thought it was she's so good with words. She says, and I pray that seated together on the couch of the shared story, we both behold the sacred mystery of Christ in us, the hope of glory. The beauty of the dawn will overcome this night. And one day, soon, we will rise. We will trade our places on this couch for an honored seat around the table. We'll sit with bodies that no longer ache and minds that no longer fear. And instead of pain, we'll share laughter. The tears we needed to glimpse grace will be wiped away by Christ's tender, scarred hands. And we'll watch with wonder as God hurls death like a fireball into the fathomless sea, never again to be seen. And wrapped in the bright linen of our perseverance, we'll see earth and heaven newborn. And from the silent spaces of sorrow within and between us will rise the most stunning song. Glory will be our son, joy will be our inheritance, God will be our king, and with his words of well done still ringing in our ears, we'll look at each other with smiles and see that this couch was a throne all along. So now I want to pray over you. I want you to pray over me. You know, pain and suffering is not an easy subject to tackle, especially because it's so personal. And every situation is loaded with nuances, and I'm going to miss some things, and Paul's going to miss some things, and Stan are going to miss some things. But I want to invite you to encourage you to not just dismiss that, but find somebody to process it with, right? And if we miss something, to work through that. I hope that if anything, that we will persevere. That as home church, we will learn to lament, to just unload our raw emotions before God, because Bible so clearly encourages it. To not stuff it away, but to be honest before Him for as long as it takes. Trusting that God is working out for good, the evil that He did not want to see happen in the first place. And yet somehow He will make beauty out of the ashes. And that He will turn the graves into gardens. And that He will turn the tears into joyful laughter. That's what I want us to pray about, is that we would step in and become the community of healing. That we will not we will not let the pain become our suffering, but rather we will persevere through that suffering. We will interpret it from the micro story of what God is doing in the world. And so I invite you to stand if you are willing and able. Let us pray that we become those who are able to heal others. Let us pray that as we experience pain and suffering, that we also learn to look for and search for the grace of God. And then in turn, don't waste the pain that happens. It's just a fact of life. Let's take that pain and become more resilient because of it, in spite of it, in the face of it. Let's use that moment to grow more compassionate, more tender towards one another. So that maybe our eyes would be open, right? So the megaphone that's shouting would rise or rouse our hearts to pay attention to the suffering that's happening all around us. And let's step in and become the people who undo already, here and now, the work that will be fully undone once heaven comes to earth. Let us pray.